I've debated a lot of people on this, and they'll say, well, no, the book of Genesis is a book of poetry. It's a book of metaphor. It's not intended to be a book of science. Well, first of all, I agree that Genesis isn't supposed to be a book of science, but any poetry or any metaphor that God uses in his word never outright contradicts the truth. Let me give you an example. Let's pretend God used the process of evolution, and what that would mean is that Adam would have really been born out of the womb of his part monkey, part human hominid mother, right? Then he would have eventually grown up. Eve, somewhere, would have been born as a baby out of the womb of her part monkey, part human hominid mother. And then she would have grown up. And then the two of them eventually would have ran into each other somewhere in the garden and then said, hey, do your parents look as freaky as mine do? Yes. Okay? That's what would have actually really happened if God used the process of evolution. Why? Why do people think it's poetry or metaphor for God to tell that account to Moses this way, that he created man from the dust of the ground and that he breathed into his nostrils the breath of life? Remember, if Adam developed in the womb of his mother, he was already a living being before his nostrils even developed. But it says he wasn't a living being until God breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. And how does it become metaphor? How does Eve, being born of the womb of her part monkey hominid mother, how does that become metaphor for God really putting Adam into a deep sleep, taking part of Adam's side, most likely his rib, crafting a woman so she'll be bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh? How does that become a metaphor or poetry for her being born through evolution? It's not. Not to mention the fact that we're told in Scripture that life was created from the dust of the ground. Yet, then what? God used evolution and he really created life in the oceans? But then he told Moses, I created it from the dust of the ground. The dust of the ground is not a metaphor for the oceans. So please understand, you cannot reconcile the two. Now, for those of you who might say, well, I don't believe that Moses would have understood all the complexities of evolutionary structures and biological design. God couldn't have explained the science to Moses in a way that he would have understood. Well, let's examine that. I would argue God wouldn't have had to. If God used the process of evolution, he wouldn't have had to explain this scientifically to Moses. You know all he would have had to do? All he would have had to do is say, if he used evolution, he could have told Moses this creation account. I created life in the oceans a long time ago, too small to see. And over long periods of time, it eventually grew into plants and animals and humans, and it was good. Wouldn't that have been a simple way for God to explain the evolutionary process to Moses, instead of making up a bunch of things that aren't true? I think so. So, no, you can't reconcile the two. But here's what's happened, unfortunately, for a lot of Christians. Because we've been so conditioned to believe evolution is true, because we've been so conditioned to believe that the earth is billions of years old, and we think science has proven that to us, what we do is we say, well, that must be true. We go to Scripture, and we twist Scripture around somehow to fit into an evolutionary worldview. What I want to do is I want to show you that the actual scientific evidence itself doesn't support evolution. It actually supports biblical creation. Problem is this: we're not given all of the evidence. When you look in your school textbooks, your science books, when you read peer-reviewed publications, which, by the way, are controlled by evolutionists, when you read science journals, which, again, are written and controlled by evolutionists, you're only getting parts of the evidence. The parts of the evidence that make it look like evolution is true. What I do is I come along and I tell you the things that they leave out.